Summer's here and it's in full swing. I love summer. Like, it's so much fun. I have camps going on. It's a blast. But it means that my life has been super, super busy and will continue to get busier as we continue to go on. So with that said, I just want to quickly explain that for the next couple of months, my podcast episodes are going to be 10 minutes or less. If there's a week where I don't have too much going on, I would like to sit down and record 10-minute podcast episode, just kind of recapping everything going on this week, making sure that you know everything, because sometimes when life gets busy, we tend to stop reading our scriptures, or we tend to read it so quickly that we gloss over facts. So this will just be a good way for you to just make sure that you are up to date on what's going on. And then I like to focus on like 1 or 2 verses in each chapter that stand out to me and I think are really significant. But there may be other weeks where I get like a 3 or 5 minute podcast that just highlights like 1 or 2 verses, and that's okay. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. Today we're going to be in Alma chapters 8 through 12. And so in chapter 8, Alma goes to teach the people in Ammonihah. And they were really wicked and they wouldn't listen, but in verse 10 we learn a really valuable lesson where Alma didn't give up, and he prayed that God would pour out the Spirit on those people so they could be baptized, which was probably a really hard thing for him. And I can just think, like, in our lives, like, how would we responded to the people? If they were a bunch of wicked people, would we have just been like, okay, I give up, these people are too wicked? Or would we say, no, let me pray about them. Let's pray that we can get these people baptized and that they can return, so that way they can know Heavenly Father's love. So I just love how he responds there. But they still didn't listen, and they end up spitting on him, and so he decides to leave. Kind of goes a little bit and is kind of really feeling down. And so in verse 15, an angel actually appears to him, and he says, "Blessed art thou, Alma, therefore lift up thy head and rejoice, for thou hast great cause to rejoice. For thou hast been faithful in keeping the commandments of God from the time which thou receivest thy first message from him. Behold, I am he that delivered it unto you." And so this is just a great message. And it makes me just wonder if he heard that and was like, well, I don't really have cause to rejoice. Like, I went to that city and I tried to spread a message and they didn't listen. Like, maybe I'm a failure. So he was feeling really down, and the angel came to him and said, listen, like, rejoice, because you've been faithful and you've tried. And so the angel continues to go on, and he says, listen, you need to go back. And at this point, he's probably like, what? Like, that they spat on me? Like, they hate me? Like, they won't listen to me. But he goes back. And it's really incredible to see what happens. So in verse 18, actually, no. Let's go to 19 and 20 real quick and read these. It says, "And as he entered the city, he was hungered, and he said to a man, will you give to an humble servant of God something to eat?" And right here, okay, verse 20, this is where it's really cool. "And the man said unto him, I am a Nephite, and I know that thou art a holy prophet of God. For thou art the man who an angel said in a vision, thou shalt receive. Therefore go with me into my house, and I will impart unto thee of my food, and I know that thou wilt be a blessing unto me in my house." This is just so amazing to see God's handiwork, because as we learn in the next chapter, God came to this man and he said, listen, and so this guy's name is Amulek, just so you know. He came to Amulek and he said, listen, there's going to be a prophet of God that's going to, or he didn't really say prophet of God even, he just said there's going to be a man who's going to need your help, and be ready. And sure enough, Alma shows up, and Amulek is like, oh my gosh, you're the guy that angel was talking about. Like, whoa, crazy. So it's just really awesome to see God's handiwork here. And what ends up happening is that these two team up and they go teach together. And it's just really, it's so incredible just to see how things turned around. And because Amulek starts teaching with him, they end up being able to change the hearts of the people. So let's go ahead and get into chapter 9, where we get to start reading the words of Alma and Amulek. And we're really just going to focus on, we're going to kind of skip to the end in verse 31 through 34, because just to save time. Basically, they've been teaching all these words or whatever, and the people didn't like what they had to say. But it's really cool because in here it says that God didn't allow, because like the people were obviously, they were upset, so they tried to capture them, put them in jail. But it's really cool because in verses 31 through 34, it talks about how God didn't allow for them to be captured yet. He didn't allow for them to be put in jail because he knew that they still had work to do. And even Alma and Amulek knew that too. They knew that God was protecting them because they still had things that they needed to teach and things they needed to do. And so it's just really, really cool right there where it says that. Then we get into chapter 10 and continue to preach. And we get to read the words of Amulek. And this is when he kind of explains his side of the story. And we're going to go into verse 7. And it kind of talks about him a little bit. And it talks about how he was a very wicked man. And at first, when the angel came to him, he was like, no, like, I don't believe you, yada, yada. But I just want to, like, I want you to... Okay, hang on. My words aren't wording. I want you to just ponder on why you think God chose Amulek. Why didn't God choose someone to be like Alma's teaching partner, like companion, but why didn't he choose someone that was righteous? Why wouldn't God choose someone who already knew the gospel? Why did he choose someone who knew it but was refusing to know it? And so it's just a very cool thing to think about there is that in our lives, God will still choose us to do things even if we might not be the best candidate for it. And sometimes us not being the best candidate can make us the best candidate, which kind of doesn't make sense, but also kind of does at the same time. So it's a really cool lesson that we can learn here from Amulek, that God will choose us to do things even when we don't feel like we're the right person for it. Then we get into verse 13 through 16, and we read about some people who were trying to trick them, and one of them was Caesar, which we'll read about more in the next chapter. And so, yeah, they tried to trick Amulek, but in verse 17, it says that God was on his side, and God helped him outsmart those. And the people, it's really interesting because the people that were trying to trick him were like the lawyers and the doctors and like all of like the really smart people, basically. But even with that, God still, because Amulek had God on his side, he was able to outsmart them. And then we get into chapter 11, and we're going to go to verse 22 here. Let me flip there real quick. Okay, so they're trying to trick him, and it says in verse 21, Caesar began to question Amulek, saying, will you answer for me a few questions which I shall ask you? Now Zeezrom was a man who was expert in the devices of the devil, that he might destroy that which was good. Therefore he said unto Amulek, will ye answer the questions which I shall put unto you? Now right here, in verse 22, it says, and Amulek said unto him, yea, if it be according to the Spirit of the Lord which is in me. For I shall say nothing which is contrary to the Spirit of the Lord. And I love that right there. I love how he's like, yeah, I'll answer your questions, but I'm not going to say anything that's against God. Like, he was like, from the very beginning, he said, yeah, I don't mind answering your questions, but I'm not going to say anything that's against God. And this was him combating their wickedness and combating them trying to trick him. It's just really cool to see that right there. So after that, Zeezrom tries to bribe him with what are called aunties, and this is like one of the biggest pieces, if not the biggest pieces, of like currency that they have. So he tries to bribe him to basically lie with a lot of money, and he ends up. We hear his response in verse 25, and he basically says no. But we're gonna skip to verse 41 and 45 because right here we get a really, really great lesson about the resurrection. And I want to just quickly stop and explain something to you. So, because I have a recommendation for you. So, I actually keep at the front of my Book of Mormon, I have, and if you're on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. If you're not on the podcast, obviously you won't, which is kind of sad. But I have these two lists at the front of my Book of Mormon, and as I've been reading, I will just take note of certain verses that talk about certain things. So, for example, I have a list of things that talk about the resurrection. Now, so far there's only one thing on the list because I just started this list a few weeks ago. But I want to start going through, and anytime I read a verse that talks a lot about, like, the resurrection, I put it on this list. So that way, come Easter time, for example, or really any time that I want to read verses about the resurrection, I can go to this list and say, okay, here are the verses that I have found in my life. Which I think it just makes it sort of special because you could go to the Gospel Library app and find lists of resurrection verses like so easily, but there's just something so special about finding them yourself and putting them on a list. And it doesn't have to be fancy. Like, my writing on these lists is actually kind of crappy. Like, you can barely read my handwriting, but it's just the fact that I was able to find that verse and put it on the list that matters. And so I very highly recommend this. I have a list for resurrection, and I also have a list for basically the pain he has felt for me, so that way I can go back and say, listen, like, he understands what I'm going through because he felt this pain. So, for example, I have Alma chapter 7 verses 11 through 12 there, and then for the resurrection I have Alma chapter 11 verses 41 through 45. So I very highly recommend that. It's something really cool that you can do, and you just need to put it like at the front of your Book of Mormon. Like, you need like a whole new book for it. So yeah, there's just an idea for you. Then we're gonna get into chapter 12. And because of the words that Amulek spoke to Zeezrom, Zeezrom is actually speechless, and he begins to feel very guilty for trying to basically trick Alma and for basically all the things that he has done. So Alma takes over talking to him, and he starts to teach him now. And it's very interesting because in verse 7 through 8 we see that because of his words, Zeezrom starts to understand the truth. And he becomes very curious and he wants to know more. And it's just really, really awesome to see, I guess, that conversion almost. How this guy was trying to trick them, and he ended, like, the opposite ended up happening. And he ended up I guess he got rid of his old ways and became a new person. So it's just really, really cool to see that. That is the end of what I want to talk about today. So I will see you guys next week. When we talk about, I guess, I don't even know what chapters it is, but I will see you guys next week. Bye.